Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer of DailyRoto.com here to walk you through some of my thoughts around playing NBA single game and showdown slates. We'll talk about these thoughts and strategies through the prism of our DailyRoto NBA optimizer. If you're interested in joining us at DailyRoto.com, you can check us out, DailyRoto.com/premium. When I think about showdown slates, the big difference between showdown slates and main slates is obviously the size in terms of the number of games of the slate, but then also the multiplier spots in terms of on FanDuel, the MVP, the star, and the pro, on DraftKings, that captain slot. And between the two sites, there's a little bit of a different approach between them. So we'll start with FanDuel. On FanDuel, the MVP, the star, and the pro, because there's no difference in salary between the spots, you're often using these spots to kind of shuffle through a few of the best plays and just usually use them in that context. With DraftKings, because the captain spot does have a different salary attached to it, you will see a little bit more of a diverse nature of options that pop up in that captain spot. Not quite as diverse as NFL because the disparities in the projections are so wide between the starters and the bench players in most cases, but still a little bit more diversity than the game in FanDuel. But just generally, when you're thinking about NBA Showdown, the first thing that, if you're using an optimizer, the first thing that you should be thinking about is there's such few number of players to choose from that you want to make sure that you're not creating constraints on an optimizer that is preventing you from finding the absolute perfect lineup. So the first thing I want you to think of in general when playing showdown or single game slates, or even smaller slates in general, is that you should have looser player restrictions. So I've created a template here for my showdown exposures, and you can see that I leave everything at 100. I don't mind having a player locked on a given slate. I don't want to force the optimizer into removing a player from consideration simply due to exposure caps. The more you do that, the weaker the lineups you'll create will be, simply because you'll be working down a player pool when there's not as many players to choose from. So you really want to let the optimizer and the projections do the work. The second thing that I want you to think through in the context of our optimizer at DailyRoto, where we often talk about the value added by creating groups and thinking through correlation strategies, is just in general in Showdown, I'm more likely to use key boosts than I am groups themselves. And the difference between a key boost and a group is very simple. A key boost, like the one I have here, that say lineups with Bogdan Bogdanovic, I want to key boost down Buddy Hield 3 percentage points in his projections. I'm still allowing lineups for Bogdan Bogdanovic and Buddy Hield to be in the same lineup together. I'm not making a rule to exclude them. Now, I do have some rules in here, like I have at most 2 of Josh Hart, Lonzo Ball, Jrue Holiday, and I'll talk through a little bit the idea of the difference between rules and boosts and why I'm using them separately. So the main concept, though, is the more rules you have, the more hard line boundaries that you create for your lineups, the more limitations you're putting on the optimizer, the more likely you're going to group out a potential winning lineup. So I only like to use rules when it comes to single game slates when it's situations where I just cannot fathom a path for this thing to happen. So the example would be, let's say, a starting center and a reserve center, guys like DeAndre Jordan and Jarrett Allen for Brooklyn, are priced similarly to some of the other reserve players. It's unlikely in that situation that DeAndre Jordan and Jarrett Allen, whose minutes are going to come at the expense of one another, end up in the same winning lineup together, because there are a number of options kind of priced around them. So in the context of the rule that I made here, at most 2 of 3 between Josh Hart, Lonzo Ball, and Jrue Holiday, these are players that if any of them were to spike, it would hurt the others. And the price tags on Lonzo and Jrue Holiday are such that it would be hard for Josh Hart to penetrate a lineup alongside them if they weren't hitting their ceiling games, just because of the price tags. Now, if all of these guys were minimum price or really cheap, I would probably not make this rule. So my thought process on this is Lonzo and Jrue Holiday are expensive enough in this context. Jrue's priced at $16,000, Lonzo's priced at $14,000, that if those two are going to be in the winning lineup together, it's going to take one of their best performances and their most playing time on the floor. And if they're getting their most playing time on the floor together, that means Josh Hart probably isn't on the floor unless something very unique happens, like a Brandon Ingram injury or something like that. So there are occasions where I will use rules in Showdown. but you'll see most of my decisions here are actually key boosts. The other rule that I had here was between Nicolo Melli, Derek Favors, and Zion Williamson. 3 players who are unlikely to play together ever. And as a result, if you were to get and have relatively expensive price tags in the case of Zion, there could be a scenario where Favors and Melli, because they're priced down a little bit more, maybe they get in there if Zion got hurt early or something like that. But in general, I think that's pretty unlikely, and so I'm going to group it out. Why do I use key boosts, though? Why do I see a benefit in key boosts as opposed to rules in these situations? Because I don't want to limit myself, but I do want my lineups to have a hint of when players negatively correlate with one another. And the way that I usually think through that is players that their playing time is dependent on one another, or their opportunities are dependent on one another. Then I do want to have them slightly spread apart in terms of the way that they're used in lineups. So in this instance, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Buddy Hield, and De'Aaron Fox are 3 players that usually on main slates, I will have rules that I use at most 2 of those 3. The reason is the 3 of them don't play on the floor a ton together when Sacramento is healthier, and generally when one of them is doing well, it results in the other one sitting. So in these cases, I did make key boosts that simply downtick Buddy Hield when Bogdan Bogdanovic is in the lineup. And I don't have to do this both ways because if you think about it, what the rule is saying that anytime Bogdan Bogdanovic is in the lineup with Buddy Hield, we're going to decrease that projection of Buddy Hield by 3 percentage points. But it's really what it's doing is decreasing that pair when they're paired together by 3 percentage points. And so I don't need to create it for Hield and Bogdanovic. It would be repetitive. And with our optimizer, because these key boosts create separate lines of possible code in iterations, we do have a limitation with the number of key boosts you can use. So I believe it's up to 8 to 11, somewhere around there for NBA. So you do have to be somewhat selective in the decisions you're making there. Some of the other guys I key boosted in the spot were Bjelica and Barnes, Ingram and Zion, 2 players that certainly can go off together in situations, but Brandon Ingram generally hits his ceiling most in games where he gets more minutes at the power forward spot, a spot that Zion largely plays most of his minutes. Jrue Holiday and Lonzo Ball, 2 players that, when Lonzo is really going well, usually it's because he's getting a lot of assists and rebounds, and Jrue Holiday would be in that same category as well. So players that I generally use negative boosts, and De'Aaron Fox here is one where I key boosted him negatively with a couple of guys. Corey Joseph, I give him a stronger negative boost with because that's his direct backup, but Bogdan Bogdanovic and Buddy Hield as well. And so the idea behind that is creating slight blips in your lineup, slight correlations in your lineup that separate some of those groups of players that might be negatively correlated. You can also do this with positively correlated players. It's a little bit more difficult in single game situations to identify those players. Back in the day when the Clippers had Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan got such a high percentage of his offense from Chris Paul assists, you could have done things like that with positive correlation. But in general, I use it more for negative correlation and kind of spread my approach. So this slate ended up not getting played. It was canceled on the final game of the NBA season before it went into suspension. But you can see when I run the 150 lineups here, you can see what FanDuel's game looks like in terms of the MVP ownership. And then we'll run this on DraftKings as well and compare some of the spreads in terms of the player allocation and also the captain and MVP ownerships. So you see here we get 14 players used in total. That's not uncommon for an NBA single game slate. In general, when you think of rotations for NBA teams, they're going to be between 9 and 11 players. There's only going to be about 22 players that are on the floor during the course of a night. And generally, only 7 or 8 on each team are going to play meaningful minutes that they could slide into the winning lineup. So 14 players is about right in terms of a player pool. And you can see pretty condensed exposures here. Our projections had De'Aaron Fox and Zion Williamson well ahead of the field here. So they're in almost every lineup. They're in the bulk of the MVP slots as well. And you can see players that were expensive similarly to them, like a Brandon Ingram, falls down. Now, if I wanted to make a decision where I wanted to have more spread exposure in an NBA Showdown setting, I could bump up the shuffle on any of these positions. Our shuffle feature simply makes it a little bit less likely for the player who was previously used in a lineup to get into the next one. But more likely for me, because I'd have a smaller player pool to work with, I would ramp up this volatility. And what volatility is doing is It's giving you a range of distribution for the player for their projection. And if you make it 10 points, it's a plus or minus 10% from their current projection in terms of how they're projected. So a player like De'Aaron Fox, who's projected for 41.33 FanDuel points, a volatility setting of 10 would give him a range of 45.4-ish to 37.2-ish that it's choosing a value from and that it's using when it's creating the lineups. And that volatility feature can be extremely useful in these showdown and single game slates for players that you think have meaningful upside but have fragile minutes projections. Now, in this New Orleans-Sacramento game, I don't think there's anybody that really fits that bill perfectly. I think a good example would be on the occasions that Dallas plays with a guy like Boban Marjanovic, who we know is such a good point per minute producer, but the playing time is so volatile. Those types of players, I will also individually bump their volatility, expanding the distribution of scorers that can be included in the profile. And that will naturally, because you're getting some more of the higher end outcomes for them, that will naturally allow them to get into some more of those lineups. But let's check out how this slate would have played out on DraftKings in terms of the difference in some of the ability in some of the distribution of players. The last thing while we do that I wanted to talk through while I'm waiting for these lineups to process here is you have the ability to create key boost and key rules around the captain spot in NBA. But because player correlations are on such a smaller level than, say, NFL, which is a sport that we talk very often about utilizing that captain spot with key correlations. For instance, if you were to use Drew Brees in a captain spot, you'd want him stacked with 2 pass catchers. That's because NFL has a lot more correlation to it. And the same could be said of MLB in terms of game that has more correlation to it. If you're using a captain hitter, for example, you might want other hitters from that lineup in those lineups as well. NBA doesn't work quite to that extent. The scoring processes are more iterative. They're not one big play that really dictates the bulk of the scoring. And as a result, with all the possessions, it takes a lot to flow through that correlation. So I don't personally, because I have a limited number of key boosts to use, I don't personally use the captain's rules nearly as much. Sometimes you can if you could use a captain rule for if Zion Williamson's captain, maybe no Derek Favors in those lineups. But in general, I don't do that very frequently. That's my personal approach. I think you want to limit the amount of constraint that you're using in these games. But you can see here on DraftKings the difference in the player pool. 18 players used in this one. You get a few 1%ers used in here as well. And that's because the range in pricing on DraftKings is wider as well. And you see a little bit more of a distribution in that captain spot. And again, that's because DraftKings adjusts the prices of the captain. Their wider range on salaries just brings in more players in the player pool. And as a result, creates more combinations that you could possibly use. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an inside look at how I attack DraftKings Showdown and FanDuel single game slates. Hopefully this will be very helpful for you when NBA season returns, and especially during the playoffs, because we get plenty of one-game slates during then. But if you want to check out more of our content, check us out over at DailyRoto.com. Thanks everyone, and best of luck in all the games.